No. The word was a ghost in the frozen air, a puff of white vapor stolen by the night. It was not shouted. It was not a command. It was a denial, a flat, dead thing spoken into the heart of the carol singer's chorus, a single, hollow note of dissent against the fragile joy of silent night. For Duke Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, the world had just fractured. One moment, he was an observer, a man cloaked in shadow and regret at the edge of the Oakhaven village green, watching the rustic, heartfelt spectacle of a living nativity. The next, he was a man drowning. The scene was simple, a makeshift stable of rough-hewn pine boughs, a nervous young man as Joseph, a collection of local children as shepherds and angels, their halos slightly askew, and in the center, seated on a stool with a blue shawl over her head, was the Madonna. In the hay-filled manger before her, a real infant slept, swaddled and serene, the star of the entire production. Alistair had been tracing the woman's profile, the clean, elegant line of her jaw, the slight curve of her nose. It was a profile that had haunted his every waking moment and tormented his dreams for 5 years. A profile he had last seen pale with shock and devastation in the cold light of the Blackwood Manor library, just before he had destroyed their world. He had told himself it was a trick of the light, a cruelty of his own guilt-ridden imagination. Hundreds of times over the past years, he had seen her in crowds, in passing carriages, in the faces of strangers. Each time his heart had seized, and each time it had been a phantom. But then she turned her head, just slightly, to adjust the blanket around the sleeping baby. The flickering lantern light caught the full plane of her face, and Alistair knew. The breath left his body in a painful rush. The carol faltered around him as his single, stark word cut through the harmony. Heads turned. The singing stopped. A villager shushed a restless child. In the sudden, ringing silence, only the crackle of the nearby bonfire remained. She heard it. Her body went utterly rigid. The hand that had been smoothing the infant's blanket froze in midair. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she raised her head, her gaze sweeping past the shepherds, past the angels, until it found him standing in the darkness beyond the circle of light. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, widened, not with joy, not with surprise, but with a cold, visceral shock that mirrored his own, quickly followed by something else, something hard and guarded and full of a pain, so deep it was almost terrifying to behold. Eleonora, his wife, the woman he had cast out, the woman who had vanished from the face of the earth, the woman he had spent the last 2 years and a significant portion of his fortune trying to find. She was here, in this forgotten hamlet, dressed in homespun wool, her hands chapped from work, her glorious auburn hair hidden beneath a common shawl. And before her, in the manger, was a child, a small boy, with a dusting of hair the exact shade of her own, and as he stirred in his sleep, a familiar furrow to his brow. Alistair's brow. The pieces of the last 5 years slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The timing of her departure. The desperate, complete way she had disappeared. He had thought she fled from shame. He had been a fool. She had been fleeing to protect their child, his son. He took a step forward, an unconscious, instinctual movement toward her, toward them. The woman he had known as the quiet, graceful Duchess of Blackwood rose to her feet. The fragile, almost timid creature he remembered was gone. In her place stood someone he did not recognize. Her spine was steel. Her expression was a mask of ice. "You have no place here, Your Grace," she said, her voice low and clear and carrying across the silent green with brutal precision. The formal title was a slap. A chasm opened between them, wider and more profound than the few yards of frosted grass. It was a declaration. He was the Duke. She was a villager playing a role. They were strangers. More than strangers. They were enemies. The villagers stared. their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning gossip. The vicar, a portly man with a kind but flustered face, stepped forward. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" Eleonora did not look at the vicar. Her eyes remained locked on Alistair's, burning with a cold fire he had never imagined she possessed. "The performance is over." She knelt, her movements swift and sure. She lifted the sleeping child from the manger, cradling him against her shoulder with a fierce, possessive tenderness that made Alistair's throat close. The baby was no prop. He was her world, a world Alistair had just invaded like a marauding army. Without another glance at him, she turned and walked away, melting back into the shadows from which he had just emerged. The crowd parted for her, a murmur of questions rippling in her wake. Alistair stood frozen, the ghost of her words hanging in the air. "Your Grace." She had built a wall around herself with 2 words, and he had no idea how to breach it. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a man of immense power and influence, a man whose quietest request was treated as a command, and he had just been dismissed, utterly and completely, by a woman in a woolen shawl holding his son. The cold of the December night sank into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the Arctic wasteland of his own heart. He had found her, and in finding her, he had finally understood the true magnitude of what he had lost. The silence of Blackwood Manor had become his penance. For the first year after she had gone, it had been a relief, a blessed quiet after the storm of his own making. His aunt, Lady Augusta Beaumont, had seen to it. She had swept through the grand rooms, removing any lingering trace of Eleonora, her scent, her books, her needlework. Augusta had declared it a cleansing, a necessary purging of a painful memory. Alistair, numb and raw, had allowed it. He had wanted the silence. He had craved the emptiness. He had believed the lies. The evidence had been so convincing, so vile. A packet of letters, delivered to him by a distraught Augusta, who claimed a footman had found them. Letters written in Eleonora's delicate script, filled with passionate declarations to a secret lover. Plans for an elopement. Cruel, dismissive words about her husband, the cold, distracted Duke. He remembered the confrontation in the library, the scent of old leather and his own rage. He had thrown the letters on the desk between them. He remembered the look on her face. Not guilt. That was the part that had begun to eat at him later. It was not guilt. It was confusion, then a dawning horror, a profound and absolute devastation. She had not even tried to defend herself. She had simply stared at him, her sea-green eyes filling with a pain so vast it had seemed to swallow the very light in the room. "If you believe this," she had whispered, her voice a thread of sound, "then there is nothing I can say." And he had believed it. He had wanted to believe it. It had explained her quiet melancholy, her distant smiles. He had seen it as a betrayal of his name, his honor, his trust. He had not seen it as the desperate unhappiness of a young bride, married to a man who treated her as little more than another beautiful acquisition for his estate. He had been a prize bull, and he had expected her to be a docile heifer. The vulgarity of the thought shamed him now. She was gone the next morning. A single suitcase was missing. Her jewels, including the breathtaking Blackwood diamonds he had given her, were left in their velvet boxes. Her wedding band, a simple gold circle, was placed precisely in the center of her dressing table. That ring had been the first crack in his certainty. An eloping lover would have taken the jewels. A woman fleeing to a new life would not have left behind her most valuable assets. But a woman whose heart had been shattered, a woman severing a tie, she would leave the ring. It was a statement, an ending. Augusta had painted it as an admission of guilt, a final act of shame. For a time, Alistair accepted it. He drank too much. He threw himself into the management of his estates with a feverish intensity. He filled the silence with work, with politics, with anything that would keep him from thinking. But the silence always returned. At night, the vast, empty bed beside him was a cold accusation. The manor, once a symbol of his power, became a mausoleum. He began to notice things. The way Augusta's smile never quite reached her eyes. The way she had so seamlessly, so eagerly, reassumed her role as mistress of the house, a position she had held before his marriage. The way she would subtly disparage Eleonora's memory, a casual, poisonous remark dropped into conversation. The doubt started as a whisper. It grew into a roar. 2 years ago, he had hired a man, a discreet investigator from London. He had not told Augusta. He had given the man the letters. "Prove them authentic," he had ordered, hoping to finally kill the doubt. The investigator had proven the opposite. The handwriting was a masterful forgery. The paper was from a batch Alistair had purchased for the estate office, an office to which only he and Augusta had regular access. The ink was a custom blend Augusta favored for her personal correspondence. The truth had been a slow-moving garrote, tightening around him. He had confronted the footman who had supposedly found the letters. The young man, long since dismissed by Augusta, had been living in comfort in a cottage on the edge of the estate. After Alistair's considerable pressure, he confessed, Lady Augusta had paid him. She had given him the packet and instructed him on what to say. The final piece was Augusta herself. He had confronted her not with rage, but with a cold, dead calm that had frightened her more than any shouting would have. He laid the investigator's report on the table. He told her of the footman's confession. She had tried to lie, to bluster, but her nerve failed her. It all came pouring out in a torrent of jealousy and resentment. She had hated Eleonora for displacing her. She had despised the girl's quiet grace, which she saw as weakness. She wanted her nephew back under her thumb, her domain secure. She had never imagined Eleonora would actually leave. She had assumed there would be a scandal, a quiet separation, and Alistair would remain, tied to Blackwood and to her. He had not cast his aunt out. That would have been too simple. He had confined her to her rooms, her world shrinking to a few gilded chambers, a prisoner in the house she had tried to conquer. Her desolation was a small, bitter mirror of his own. And then the real search began. Not for proof, but for Eleonora. It was a hopeless task. She had vanished. No one of her description had bought passage on any ship. No one had seen her. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. He had begun to fear she was dead, a victim of some terrible fate on the road. The guilt was a physical weight, a sickness in his soul. Until tonight. Until a village nativity and the turn of a head. Now, standing on the frozen village green, the last of the crowd dispersing into their warm cottages, Alistair knew his penance was only just beginning. Finding her was not the end. It was the start of a battle he did not know how to fight. How did one atone for destroying a life, for stealing 5 years, for not knowing his own son? He saw the vicar hovering nearby, his expression a mixture of clerical concern and provincial curiosity. Alistair walked toward him, his boots crunching on the frost. "The woman," Alistair said, his voice hoarse. "The one who played the part of Mary. Where can I find her?" The vicar, a Mr. Willoughby, wrung his hands. "Ah, you mean Ellen. A good woman, a very good woman, but very private. She helps Mrs. Gable up at the Swan's Rest Inn. Has for years." The Swan's Rest. An inn. His Duchess, who had grown up surrounded by servants and silks, was working in an inn. The absurdity and the horror of it struck him anew. "She has a son," Alistair stated, the words feeling foreign and momentous on his tongue. "Young Thomas, yes," the vicar said, smiling. "A bright little lad. A bit of a miracle, he is. Ellen arrived here 5 years ago, you see, in a dreadful state. Lost, with nothing but the clothes on her back. Mrs. Gable, who has a heart as big as this village, took her in. A few weeks later, we discovered she was with child. Young Thomas has been a blessing to them both. A lost woman with nothing. He had done that. He had cast her out with such cold fury that she had fled into the unknown, pregnant and alone. The carefully constructed armor of his ducal pride crumbled into dust, leaving him exposed and raw. "Thank you, Vicar," Alistair managed to say. He turned toward the faint light of the inn at the far end of the village street. Each step was a judgment. He was walking toward his reckoning. The air inside the Swan's Rest was thick with the smell of roasting meat, wood smoke, and damp wool. A cheerful fire roared in a great stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the dark wooden beams and scrubbed pine tables. It was a place of simple, honest warmth, a world away from the cold, curated perfection of Blackwood Manor. A stout woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun, and a surprisingly kind face stood behind the bar, polishing a pewter tankard. This had to be Mrs. Gable. She looked up as Alistair entered, her eyes giving nothing away as she took in his expensive, tailored greatcoat and the unmistakable air of authority that clung to him like a second skin. "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice was steady, practical. Before Alistair could answer, a door behind the bar opened, and Eleonora emerged. She had shed the blue shawl. Her glorious hair was pinned up in a simple, severe knot at the nape of her neck, but loose tendrils had escaped to curl around her temples. She wore a plain, dark dress and a white apron. She was carrying a stack of clean plates. She stopped dead when she saw him. The plates in her hands rattled. For a heart-stopping second, he thought she might drop them. But her fingers tightened, her knuckles white. Her gaze flicked from him to Mrs. Gable, a silent, desperate message passing between them. Mrs. Gable set the tankard down with a soft thud. "Ellen, go and see to Thomas. I'll handle this." Her tone was protective, her loyalty absolute. She was the ally Eleonora had found, the one she had deserved all along. Eleonora hesitated, her eyes still on Alistair, wide and wary, like a cornered doe. Then she gave a small, jerky nod and disappeared back through the door, the click of the latch an emphatic sound in the quiet room. "I need a room," Alistair said to Mrs. Gable, his voice low. The innkeeper's eyes narrowed. She knew who he was. The entire village would be buzzing with it by now. A duke did not simply appear in Oakhaven. "We're full," she said flatly. It was an obvious lie. The inn was nearly empty, save for a few locals nursing ales by the fire. "I believe you can find one," Alistair said, his tone even but carrying the weight of unspoken power. It was a tool he despised using now, but he was desperate. He would not be turned away. He would not lose her again. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy purse, placing it on the bar. The clink of gold sovereigns was obscene in the homey quiet. It was a crude gesture, a rich man's solution, and he hated himself for it, but he had no other currency here. His name, his title, they were liabilities. Only gold was universal. Mrs. Gable stared at the purse, then back at his face. Her expression was one of profound distaste. "Her name is Ellen," she said, her voice sharp, "and she and the boy are under my protection. Whatever business you have with her, you will conduct it with respect, or you will answer to me. Duke or no duke." It was the most direct, unimpressed address he had received in his adult life. He felt a flicker of grudging admiration for the woman. She was a fortress, and Eleonora was safe behind her walls. "I have no intention of causing her any more harm," Alistair said, and the sincerity in his own voice surprised him. The raw truth of it was an ache in his chest. "I only wish to speak with her." Mrs. Gable considered him for a long moment, her gaze sharp and assessing. She seemed to be weighing the man against the title, the desperation in his eyes against the arrogance of his station. Finally, she gave a curt nod. "The room at the top of the stairs. It's small, but it's clean. Supper is in half an hour." She pushed the purse back across the bar. "And I'll not be taking your gold. You'll pay the proper rate like any other guest. 5 shillings a night, food extra." He had been dismissed again, his wealth rendered meaningless. It was both infuriating and strangely humbling. He took the purse and inclined his head. "Thank you." As he turned toward the stairs, he heard her add, "And you'll not go near her or the boy tonight. She's had enough of a shock. Let her be." It was an order. He obeyed it. His room was small and cold. A narrow bed, a washstand with a pitcher of icy water, and a single window that looked out over the dark, sleeping village. It was a monk's cell. After the sprawling, lonely grandeur of his ducal suite at Blackwood, it felt more honest, more real. He sat on the edge of the hard mattress, the unfamiliar textures a stark reminder of the world Eleonora now inhabited. He had spent 5 years surrounded by silk and velvet, waited on by a silent army of servants. He had eaten the finest foods, drunk the rarest wines, and all of it had tasted of ash. She had lived here, in this simple, hard-working place. She had scrubbed floors, served meals, and raised their son. She had calloused her hands and strengthened her back. She had not merely survived, she had remade herself. The fragile Duchess was gone, and in her place was Ellen, a woman of substance and steel, a woman who had every right to hate him. He thought of the child, Thomas, his son, a boy of nearly 5 years. He had missed everything. The first word, the first step, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories. He was a father who had been absent for the entirety of his son's life. The loss was a physical chasm inside him. Augusta had not just stolen his wife, she had stolen his son, and he, in his blind, arrogant pride, had let her. Sleep was impossible. He lay on the narrow bed, fully clothed, listening to the sounds of the inn, the murmur of voices from the common room below, the clatter of pots from the kitchen, the eventual creeping silence as the house settled for the night. He listened for her footstep in the hall, for the cry of a child, for any sign of the life she had built without him. But he heard nothing. The next morning, he rose before dawn. The air in the room was frigid. He washed his face with the ice-cold water from the pitcher, the shock of it a welcome distraction. He had a purpose now. It was no longer about finding her. It was about atonement. He did not know if forgiveness was possible, or if he even deserved it. But he had to try. He had to prove to her that the man who had condemned her was not the man who stood before her now. He went downstairs. The common room was empty, the fire reduced to glowing embers. He found his way to the back of the inn, toward the kitchen. There was a yard outside, a woodshed, and a large, menacing pile of unsplit logs. An axe was leaning against the chopping block. He took off his fine greatcoat, folding it carefully over a fence rail. He rolled up the sleeves of his pristine linen shirt. The axe was heavy, its handle worn smooth from use. He had never chopped wood in his life. His servants had servants for such tasks. He lifted the axe and swung. The blade bit into the log with a satisfying thud, but it did not split. He grunted, wrenched it free, and swung again, and again. It was clumsy, inefficient work. His arms began to ache, his back protested, and blisters soon formed on his soft, uncalloused hands. But he kept going. It was penance, a small, physical act in a world where his apologies were just words. Each swing was for a day he had been wrong. Each log that finally split was for a lie he had believed. He worked until sweat ran down his temples, until his hands were raw and bleeding, until a respectable pile of firewood stood beside the block. He was leaning on the axe, breathing heavily, when the kitchen door opened. Eleonora stood there, a bucket in her hand. She was on her way to the well. She froze when she saw him, her eyes taking in his disheveled state, the sweat on his brow, the axe in his hand, the raw, bleeding blisters. Her expression was unreadable. It was not pity. It was not anger. It was a deep, unsettling stillness, as if she were looking at a creature from another world who had inexplicably appeared in her own. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice quiet. "The woodpile was low," he said simply, his own voice rough with exertion. She stared at the pile of split logs, then back at his hands. "You will ruin your hands." It was a statement of fact, not a concern. "They will heal," he said. A small boy appeared at her side, peering around her skirts. He had a cloud of auburn hair and wide, curious eyes the color of a summer sky. His eyes. Alistair felt his breath catch. They were a perfect, startling match for his own. The boy looked at Alistair, then at the axe. "Did you chop all that wood, mister?" he asked, his voice small and clear. Alistair's heart constricted. He wanted to kneel, to gather the boy into his arms, to tell him who he was. But one look at the fierce, protective set of Eleonora's jaw stopped him. He was Mister, a stranger. "I did," Alistair replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You're very strong," the boy said with childlike awe. He held up a small, crudely carved wooden bird. "I made this." Alistair looked at the bird. It was simple but endearing. "It's a fine bird." "Thomas," Eleonora said sharply, her hand coming to rest on her son's shoulder. "Go inside. Breakfast is ready." The boy looked from his mother to the stranger, his brow furrowed in that familiar way. He clearly wanted to ask more questions, but he was an obedient child. He gave Alistair one last, curious look and scurried back into the kitchen. Now they were alone. The silence stretched, filled only by the crisp morning air and the distant crowing of a rooster. "Why are you here, Alistair?" she asked, finally using his name. It sounded alien, a relic from a past life. "To find you," he said. "To tell you I was wrong." A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. "You are 5 years too late for that. I no longer require your validation." "This isn't about what you require. It is about what I owe," he said, taking a step closer. He held up his ruined hands, a pathetic offering. "Eleonora, I know everything. About Augusta. The letters, the footman, the lies, all of it." She flinched as if he had struck her. The blood drained from her face. She had spent 5 years believing he was a monster. The idea that he was a fool instead was, perhaps, even more damning. "You know," she whispered, "I have known for 2 years. I have been searching for you ever since." "You expect me to believe that?" Her voice was laced with a deep, corrosive skepticism. "The great Duke of Blackwood, duped by his aging aunt. It is a convenient story. It is the truth." He let the axe fall to the ground. He needed her to see the truth in his eyes. "She confessed. I have the investigator's report. The proof is absolute. She hated you for taking her place. She wanted to drive a wedge between us, to isolate me. She never thought you would run." Eleonora wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection that tore at him. "And you let her. You believed her. You looked at me, your wife, and you saw a liar and an adulteress. You threw her words at me like stones, and you did not even wait for an answer. That is the truth I remember." Every word was a nail in his coffin. She was right. He had been so steeped in his own pride, his own ducal honor, that he had not once considered the woman who stood before him. He had not considered her character, her gentleness, her loyalty. He had only seen the insult to his name. "I was a fool," he said, the words tasting like poison. "Arrogant and blind and cruel. There is no excuse for what I did. None. I am not here to offer excuses. I am here to beg." The word hung in the air between them. A Duke of Blackwood did not beg. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something other than anger or fear in her eyes. It was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who had fought for her life, for her child's life, and had won. only to have the ghost of her past appear in her yard, chopping her wood. "Beg for what?" she asked, her voice flat. "Forgiveness? Do you think it is a trinket you can demand now that you have decided you want it?" "No," he said quickly. "Not forgiveness. A chance. A chance to prove that I am not the man I was. A chance to know my son." Her face hardened at the mention of Thomas. "He is my son. I have kept him safe. I have kept him happy. He has a good life here. He does not need a father who appears after 5 years with a title and a bag of gold. He deserves to know who he is. He is the heir to Blackwood. He is my heir." "He is Thomas Gable," she shot back, her voice sharp with defiance. "He is an innkeeper's grandson. Blackwood is a poisoned word in this house. It means nothing to us." He saw the unbreachable wall in her eyes and knew he could not force this. He had tried force once before, and it had led to this disaster. He had to find another way. "I will not press you," he said, his voice dropping. "I will not demand anything, but I will not leave Eleonora. I will stay here, in this village. I will take the small room at the inn. I will pay my way, and I will wait. If you need a fence mended, I will mend it. If you need wood chopped, I will chop it. If you need a wall plastered, I will learn how to plaster it. I will be here, and perhaps one day you will believe me." She stared at him, her mind clearly reeling. This was not the Duke she knew. The Duke she knew would have issued commands. He would have brought lawyers and threats. He would have tried to take her son. This man, with his bleeding hands and his quiet, determined plea, was a stranger. "You cannot stay here," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Watch me," he said softly, and so began the Duke's strange, public penance. Alistair Beaumont, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, became the resident handyman at the Swan's Rest. He rose at dawn and worked until dusk. He chopped wood. He repaired the leaky roof of the stables. He rebuilt a section of dry stone wall that had collapsed at the edge of the inn's property. He worked with a grim, single-minded determination that baffled the villagers and infuriated Eleonora. He did not speak to her unless she spoke to him first. He kept a respectful distance. When he saw Thomas in the yard, he would offer a quiet smile, answer the boy's endless questions about his work, and then retreat before he overstepped the unspoken boundary. He ate his meals alone at a small table in the corner of the common room, enduring the curious stares of the locals. He was courting her, not with flowers or jewels, but with sweat and splinters. He was showing her, day by day, that he was capable of humility. He was dismantling his own ducal persona, piece by painful piece, right in front of her. Eleonora watched him from the windows of the inn, her heart a tangled mess of conflicting emotions. A part of her, the part that had been wounded so deeply, wanted to despise him for this display. It was a performance, she told herself, a grand, ducal gesture of false humility. But another part of her, a part she had thought long dead, watched him work, his expensive shirt stained with dirt, his face set in a mask of concentration, and felt a flicker of the man she had once thought she loved. She saw the blisters on his hands turn to calluses. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes at the end of the day. This was not a performance. It was an ordeal, and he was enduring it for her. Mrs. Gable watched it all with her shrewd, knowing eyes. She said nothing to Eleonora, but she started leaving a pot of salve on the table where Alistair ate his supper. She made sure his meals were the heartiest she could provide. She had seen the truth in his eyes that first night, and his actions now were confirming her judgment. A week into his strange, self-imposed exile, a carriage arrived from London. A soberly dressed man, Alistair's solicitor, emerged and spoke with the Duke for an hour in the common room. After the man left, Alistair sought Eleonora out. He found her in the small garden behind the inn, gathering the last of the winter herbs. "I have news," he said, his voice quiet. He did not approach too closely, respecting her space. Lady Augusta has been removed from Blackwood. Her allowance has been terminated. She has been sent to live with distant relations in the north. She will have no more power, no more influence. The estate is clean." Eleonora straightened up, her hands full of rosemary. She looked at him, her expression guarded. He was systematically removing every obstacle, every excuse. He was burning the old world down to prove he was ready to build a new one. "That is your family business," she said coolly. "It has nothing to do with me." "It has everything to do with you," he countered, his voice raw. "She is the poison that infected us. I have removed the poison. Blackwood is just a house, Eleonora. A cold, empty house. It has been for 5 years. It has no mistress. It has no heir in residence. It is waiting." "Waiting for what?" she whispered, her resolve beginning to fray at the edges. "For its duchess, and for its future duke, who is currently carrying a carved wooden bird in his pocket." She flinched, her protective instincts rising. "Do not use him." "I am not using him. I am acknowledging him. He is my son. I look at him and I see myself. I see you. I see 5 years of a life I can never get back. All I can do is try to be worthy of the years to come." That night, a storm blew in, a fierce, howling gale that rattled the window panes of the old inn. In the middle of the night, a cry echoed from the room Eleonora shared with her son, a child's pained, feverish wail. Eleonora was at his side in an instant. Thomas was burning with fever, his small body trembling. She bathed his forehead with a cool cloth, her heart pounding with a familiar fear. He was a strong child, but the winters were harsh and sickness could take hold quickly. There was a soft knock on her door. She froze. "Eleonora?" Alistair's voice, low and concerned. "I heard him cry. Is he all right?" "He has a fever," she called back, her voice tight. "Let me help." "We are fine. Please," he said, and the desperation in that single word broke through her defenses. "He is my son, too. Let me help." She hesitated for a long moment. The old Eleonora would have locked the door. The new Ellen, the pragmatic innkeeper's assistant, knew that a second pair of hands in a long night of fever was a blessing. She opened the door. Alistair stood there, his hair disheveled from sleep, his face etched with worry. He looked past her to the small bed where Thomas tossed and whimpered. He did not rush in. He waited for her permission. "The fire in the common room is still warm," he said. "We should bring him down. It will be better than this cold room." She nodded, a silent concession. He went ahead of her, and by the time she carried the blanket-wrapped Thomas downstairs, Alistair had built the fire up into a gentle, warming blaze. He had pulled a comfortable armchair close to the hearth. They spent the rest of the night there. They did not speak much. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. He held Thomas while she prepared a fever-reducing tea. She bathed the boy's face while Alistair whispered nonsense stories to him, his deep voice a soothing rumble. In the gray, pre-dawn light, the fever broke. Thomas, slick with sweat but finally cool, fell into a deep, peaceful sleep in his father's arms. Alistair looked at the sleeping child, his face a mask of such profound love and regret that it made Eleonora's chest ache. He looked up and met her eyes over the boy's head. "Thank you," he whispered. "He is my son," she replied, but the words had no heat. It was just a fact. "He is our son," he corrected gently. She looked at the scene before her. The powerful Duke of Blackwood, humbled and exhausted, holding their sleeping child in a common inn, his clothes rumpled, his face smudged with soot from the fire. This was not the man who had cast her out. This was someone new, someone who had earned the right to be here, in this quiet, vulnerable moment. The wall inside her, the great, towering wall of anger and pain she had built over 5 years, did not crumble. It simply dissolved. "When he is well," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You can tell him who you are." Hope, fierce and blinding, flared in Alistair's eyes. It was more than he had dared to dream of. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. It was the crack of light under a door that had been sealed shut. A few days later, when Thomas was fully recovered and chasing chickens in the yard again, Alistair found Eleonora by the stone wall he had repaired. He had a small velvet pouch in his hand. "This was left on your dressing table," he said, his voice quiet. He opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his palm. A simple, familiar gold band, her wedding ring. "I have kept it with me, every day." She looked at the ring, gleaming in the pale winter sun. It was a symbol of a past she had fled, of a promise that had been broken, but it was also a symbol of what could have been, what could, perhaps, still be. "I cannot wear that," she said softly. "I am not that person anymore." "I know," he said. He did not try to give it to her. He simply closed his hand around it. "The Duchess of Blackwood was a girl I did not deserve, and did not know how to love. I am hoping you will give me the chance to learn how to love Ellen Gable." She looked away from him, toward the distant hills, her heart in turmoil. The life she had built here was safe. It was hers. To return to Blackwood, even with this changed man, was a risk. It meant facing the ghosts of the past, the suffocating weight of a title she had shed. But it also meant giving her son his birthright. It meant giving this broken, repentant man a chance at fatherhood. It meant, perhaps, giving herself a chance at a happiness she had never thought possible. "Blackwood will be different," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "It will be our home, not a museum. You will run it as you see fit. We will fill it with life, with laughter, with more children if you would have them. We will build something new, Eleonora, on our own terms." She looked at him then, at his earnest, hopeful face, at the calluses on his hands, and she knew he meant it. He was not asking her to return to the gilded cage. He was asking her to help him build a home. A small smile, the first genuine smile she had given him since his arrival, touched her lips. It was a fragile thing, but it was real. "Thomas will need a pony," she said. Relief and joy washed over Alistair's face, so potent it was almost painful to witness. He laughed, a real, unburdened sound. "He shall have a whole stable of them." They returned to Blackwood Manor not as a conquering duke and his reclaimed duchess, but as a man and a woman who had been to hell and back, leading their small, chattering son by the hand. The great house was the same, but they were different. The air no longer felt sterile and oppressive. It felt full of possibility. Eleonora did not put on the Blackwood diamonds. She ran the house with the practical efficiency she had learned at the Swan's Rest, terrifying the stuffy butler and delighting the rest of the staff. She established funds to support village schools and provide for widows, turning her experience of hardship into a force for good. Alistair, for his part, was a changed man. He was a partner, not a patriarch, a father, not just a duke. His greatest joy was not in Parliament or at his London club, but on the floor of the nursery, helping his son build towering castles of wooden blocks. One evening, months later, they stood by the window of the library, the very room where their world had once shattered. A warm fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, spring was turning the parkland green. Thomas was asleep upstairs. Alistair took her hand. He opened his palm, revealing the gold wedding band that he still carried. "I know you are not the same person," he said softly, "and I thank God for it. But I am not the same person either. Perhaps these two new people could make a new promise." Eleonora looked at the ring, then at his face, at the love and respect she saw shining in his eyes. She held out her left hand. With trembling fingers, Alistair slid the ring back onto her finger. It was not a chain. It was not a claim of ownership. It was a circle, unbroken, a promise, remade. He drew her into his arms, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the dead, empty silence of regret. It was the peaceful, living silence of home.